Hey everybody, this is Dylan and I am here. I have the great privilege to be here with Dr. Doug Lisle, psychologist here at the True North Health Center. He also works at the McDougall program, and we're going to be talking about one of the key components that I feel like a lot of people, I was one of them, overlook when they first try to get healthy. We know that it's all about the food, but it's not just that easy. We have to figure out how to sanely continue to eat the food. And so Dr. Lisle and I are going to talk about some of those concepts. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, pleasure. Absolutely.
Could you give us just a little big picture overview of the pleasure trap? I always tell everybody to read The Pleasure Trap, and so maybe you could give them a little insight.
Pleasure trap is the story of the way that human nature has been now trapped. That we are now in a situation where in our natural history we developed certain instincts that were vital for making decisions on all kinds of things, but particularly about food. So we're designed, as all creatures are, to be very sophisticated at actually detecting calorie differences in food, where the more calories that are in the food, the more valuable the food is. Mm-hmm. The whole reason you eat is for energy, and so you can expect that your nervous system is designed to be able to detect energy differences in the different kinds of foodstuffs. And so in our natural history, we have a preference for foods that have greater energy densities or just essentially more caloric. Every bite counts, every bite you have to fight for. And so if the bites that you have more calories in them, then you need a signal to tell you that you are eating the right thing. And that signal is going to be essentially signaled by dopamine in what's called the pleasure pathway in the brain. So what has happened is that all creatures have these kind of preferences. So all kinds of creatures have preferences for, of the foods that they eat, they like the ones that are more dense. So my buddy Howard Lyman, the Mad Cowboy, told me that cows are very crafty about which grass they eat. And there's a kind of grass that has greater calorie density than other grasses, and he says if you put the cattle out there, they'll always eat that grass first before they go to the other grass. They'll just wipe it out. Okay, and so you, as a living creature that needs energy, you're a homing pigeon, or you're like a laser-guided missile. You are going to go for the richest food, typically. The problem is in the modern environment, we have now created foods that are artificially calorically dense. They are richer than any food of your natural history. And so what we've created is what I call magic food. And that magic food goes in and does a dance on the pleasure centers of your brain and basically tells you you are absolutely doing the right thing. That's what chocolate cheesecake is, that's what Coca-Cola is, that's what Cinnabon is, that's what Krispy Kreme donuts are, that's what Tony Roma's ribs are, all of it. French fries, potato chips, every ice cream, all of it. Every single food that is super popular that people love to eat, it all has the same thing in common. And that the commonality is that the food is artificially rich. And so the nervous system is essentially being pushed by its instincts to say, that's what we should be eating, that's what we should be eating. And every time you eat it, it says you did the right thing. And that is precisely how you get an animal that essentially just burgeons out of control with its behavior. It's trapped by its own instincts into doing what it thinks is the right thing when it's absolutely the wrong thing. That's what the pleasure trap is. It follows what is pleasurable, and that's the great problem that we face even after we figure it out.
So how do we break free?
Well, what we know is that essentially whenever you create something like the rich food, magic food, magic food is in principle nothing different than what we call a class of problems that we call supernormal stimuli. So cigarettes are supernormal stimuli, heroin is supernormal stimuli, alcohol is supernormal stimuli. What all these are is they are products that will over-activate the pleasure centers of the brain. So there's essentially two different types of pleasure centers. One of them is an excitatory euphoria. Those are the dopamine pathways. That's going to be things like nicotine, alcohol will do that, cocaine, methamphetamine, and certainly French fries. Okay, so all of these things are hyperactivating the dopamine pathway, which is exciting. The other pathway is the endorphin pathway. That's a design experience that instead of exciting you to do something more, it's basically telling you afterwards you did the right thing. So when a human being has an orgasm, or any animal has an orgasm, that's an endorphin storm. That's the biggest blast of endorphin that an animal ever gets. Okay, and so when you digest food, that is in the process of digestion, endorphins are being released. It's the post-excitatory euphoria moment where suddenly the system says, we're now reminding you you just did the right thing. While you're in the middle of it, it's the dopamine that is telling you you're doing the right thing, keep going. You're doing the right thing, keep going. After you're finished, the endorphin system says you did the right thing. Those two different experiences, slightly different pleasure experiences, can both be trapped by different classes of stimuli. So the opioids, heroin, morphine, oxycodone, all that kind of stuff, Percocet, Darvocet, all of that. All those things are potentially seriously addictive because they are supernormal stimuli in the endorphin pathway. Excitatory pathway is going to be methamphetamine, cocaine, things of that nature, cigarettes.
Right.
The food is supernormal on both pathways. Now, it's not highly supernormal, so this isn't why people aren't, standing, shivering, figuring out how it is that they got to the corner of 42nd Street without their clothes on. No, that isn't what food does to you. But it just continues to beckon you into the trap. And as you repeatedly go to the trap, it's far more akin to cigarettes. Mm-hmm. Cigarettes don't, quote, destroy lives the way hardcore drugs do, because they're not that intense. They're just intense enough, though, to make it really hard to get out of it. And that is precisely the way magic food is. It's a kissing kin of cigarette smoking. It's very close. Cigarette smoking is actually a little bit more intense, but it's really the same process, and it's about the same fight to get out of the trap.
Yeah. I get a lot of people that are confusing the idea of willpower. Can you speak to that and tell them that it isn't necessarily about having a really strong sense of willpower to get out of this?
Yes, there's a lot of different ways we could look at willpower, but one of the things we have to look at is that this is not a problem that you were ever designed to solve. So the human will is really about your ability to see your long-term best interest and to make sure that you're computing. You're not overemphasizing the short-term gain. So what willpower is it's a feature of a complex animal brain that can run multiple agendas in its mind's eye, and it can compute several different possible outcomes, and then it can choose the outcome that has the overall balance of the best payoff. It's actually what the mind is essentially it's a gambling machine. And or you could call it an investment machine if you want. However you like to view Wall Street, that's how you look at it, okay? But it's a casino, and life is a casino. And the brain's job is to analyze the costs and benefits of multiple courses of action. You won't see this in a simple animal. They can only make one computation. If you're a dung beetle, you don't have the concept of willpower. But if you are another creature that is smarter and can run multiple potentials in your head, you will have willpower. So Thompson's gazelle has willpower. They essentially have to decide when they should have one more bite of grass and when they need to run from the predator. And they will actually have some cognitive dissonance over that, and they have machinery that enables them to make those computations and then make essentially the right computation virtually every time. So do you. So you have the ability to decide when it's time to quit the project and go home and go to sleep, when it's time to back out of a dangerous situation because it's looking scary. You have excellent ability to actually judge long-term cost-benefit analysis. That's why people can live so long. They make a lot of decisions, and they make them essentially with this extraordinary instinctual capability to actually run multiple agendas. The problem is that when you have part of the agenda is not playing fair, because it's causing supernormal action in the pleasure centers of the brain. When you have that, it's effectively that this magnificent calculator that's called your brain, every time you hit a 4, it thinks it's a 9. Okay, so you keep getting the wrong answer.
Okay.
And so willpower is, people are wringing their hands at this problem and they're saying, you've got to have willpower, but the truth is you naturally have an excellent amount of willpower. You have just the right amount to checkmate bad short-term decision making. You have that automatically. And you do have some cognitive dissonance when you're not sure whether you should go for the short-term easy thing or the long-term harder thing. Anybody that's thought, well, maybe I should just quit at my bachelor's degree, or maybe I should work hard and get a master's. I mean, this is all sort of long-term thinking that everybody fights this out, and human beings do this naturally. But the problem is what if you stopped at the bachelor's degree and you were a heroin addict, they gave you a bunch of heroin? You'd be like, well, that must be what I should do then, is stop right here and not continue, you see.
Right.
And this is exactly what the problem is it messes up the computational system. The problem effectively isn't willpower. The problem is we have to reach into our environment and clean out and essentially sanitize our mental food environment, if not our physical food environment,
right,
so that we take this brain closer back to the Stone Age, so that it can make very reasonable decisions, which it will by nature, once you get out of the trap. The trap is the very same trap that any addictive process causes, which is essentially that the mind learns and remembers where the supernormal stimuli are, and it will direct behavior there because it's the most rewarding behavior. And so it's a process. You have to go through the process and you have to white knuckle it. And if it's heroin, the white knuckling is unbelievable. Right. It's something that is essentially beyond the human ability to do. Almost nobody ever escapes that trap. It's virtually zero. I mean, there are a few people that have, but you are talking about, it is not because these people are weak or impulsive or don't have good brains. The problem is that the problem is simply beyond what human beings were supposed to do. It would be like you're supposed to park your car by getting out and lifting it and putting it into the parking place. It's simply almost not doable. Cigarettes are pretty close. So it's a whole order of magnitude down, but you see how extraordinarily difficult it is for people to think through their long-term best interests, right, and to actually get control of that problem. It turns out that the most effective way that anybody ever quit smoking cigarettes was what? Environmental.
Right.
When they suddenly made it so that you had to go down from the high-rise, go all the way down the elevator, 47 floors, and then you had to go outside on the street, and you get away from the doors, and then you light up the cigarette for 7 minutes, and then you go all the way back up the elevator. Suddenly we went from a population that had 50% of its population smoking down to about 18. So a whole lot of people were successful just because we changed the environmental parameters.
Right.
And so the same thing is what people have to do with their own environment with food.
Right.
You change the environment, and we make it possible for your natural willpower, which knows it wants to go this direction and make better decisions. We give it a chance. If we aren't ruthless with our environment, if we don't do a really good job, we're in trouble. We're now making it easy to keep lighting up effectively.
And can you also talk about, you've talked in the past about systems, creating a system that allows you to keep your environment clean, and also going on record with like an experiment, a set of rules.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that can trap people are naturally rebellious. They don't like to be told what to do, and they don't like to be in boxes where it's rigid. There are a few people that are sort of OCD-like, that like that, like they want the rules and they'll follow the rules perfectly.
Right.
But that's 5% of us. Most of us are a little too freewheeling. And when we feel rules pushing in on us, we push back and we don't like it. And so one of the ways to get yourself through the struggles with the pleasure trap is to view it as an experiment. And you're not really tricking yourself. We are going to run an experiment. And the notion is you want to run an experiment, I would say 6 weeks. That conceptually what we're going to do is we're going to spend a week sort of getting ready, getting our systems kind of in place, getting organized what we're going to eat most of these meals, and getting our house clean. And the idea is, for once in our lives, we're going to live in a clean environment. We're going to do it clean. We're not bringing in any potato chips. We're not bringing in any soy ice cream. We're just going to actually do this right once, just to do it. That stokes the adventurous chip inside of people that don't like to be constrained. It's the notion of, I'm going to do an adventure. Why shouldn't I? And in this way, you can quiet down the little chirping that is coming from your memory systems that are saying, wait a second, what about that rich food in the environment that would be such an unbelievably good idea to eat right now? Because after all, we're designed by nature to remember where all the rewards are in the environment and to go get them. And one of the best rewards there is the richest possible food. So don't you remember the Reese's Pieces that are sitting right there in the pantry? Okay, this is what it is that this nervous system is going to do. It's going to continue to try to pull us back into this trap because it views that behavior, the Stone Age brain that is alive and well inside of us, views that behavior as the most effective, most intelligent behavior that it's got. And so we have to override that with new information. But the new information that you're overriding with is an instinct. That's actually learned circuits, and they're not as deep. And so as a result, that's why we want to clean our environment out, tease the rebellious part of you to say, we're going to do this for 6 weeks and see what it feels like. We're going to give it a shot. Let's do an honest thing. And very often, if people will dig through that process, if they'll organize well enough and they are sufficiently prepared for some of the social challenges, that if they get through there, they'll realize, wow, I feel really good. And it isn't necessarily that they won't wobble and get back on the trap, but they very well may find their way through this several times over the next 10 years. And they may spend 70% of the next 10 years out of the trap and 30% back into the trap, and that's fine. I tell my cigarette smokers that our job is to run an experiment to see if we can get you out of this. And I don't really care if you relapse. That's not what's important. What's important is out of the next 20 years, if you're smoking 2 years out of the next 20 years, that is a phenomenal victory. Okay, I don't care whether 20 years from now you're smoking. What I care about is in the next 20 years, did you not smoke 18 of them? Right. Because if you did, we're going to be fine. But if you didn't, if you weren't willing to go through this process and get in what I call a groove for a while and live really well, if you don't do that, then we're looking at big prices.
Right.
Yes.
You alluded to some social pressures, which is another big topic that we talk about. From friends, family, this can be a very taxing change on our relationships.
To say the least. Yes, sure. The thing is, once again, probably one of the most valuable things to signal to our social environment is that we're running an experiment. And because this way, they won't get this feeling that they're being left behind, and that you've joined a new cult and that you're going to live on a higher yogic plane than them. Right. We don't want that signal because that breeds resentment, and then it breeds some serious motivation to drag you down and to put pressure on you to crack and then be just like them. So we want to get out of that space of us essentially being above. So that's why we say that we're running an experiment and we don't know what's going to happen. We're just doing it sort of for fun and intellectual fascination, just to see what happens. And when people lecture to us that we're making a mistake and that this is wrong and that you're not going to get enough protein and blah, 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 we just tell them, hey, you're probably right. You know, could be, who knows? We actually have this attitude of, yeah, well, let's see what happens. And, you know, not too much can go wrong in a few weeks. And if we take that attitude, we can essentially diffuse a great deal of the anxiety that they have, which is that we believe we're going to be lording over them and looking down. Okay. So we're signaling a bunch of humility. And when people ask me where do I get my protein from, I tell them I don't know. Okay. And that way, these are obviously people that don't know that I'm an authority on the subject. So if they just are learning, or they can see, and they cross-examine me about what I'm eating, and they ask me why, and I tell them, well, I'm doing a plant-based thing. And they say, well, where do you get your protein from? I tell them, I don't know. And interestingly enough, that's almost the last question of the conversation. Their Stone Age mind was actually somewhat anxious about the idea that I was doing something new and different in order to demonstrate genetic superiority. Now, they don't know that that's what they're worried about, but that is what they're worried about. And so by indicating to them that I'm Mr. Magoo, that I actually don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, but I'm just doing it because I'm running an experiment, or I read this book, or heard this guy talk, it seemed like a cool thing to do, so I'm giving it a try, see what happens. That attitude lets them know that this is not the dynamic, that the dynamic is still eyeball to eyeball, and I'm not trying to shine and make them look bad. And that becomes a key issue even with family and friends. As we go about this, we want to act like we're essentially stumbling and bumbling a little bit and experimenting, and i.e. it could be a fad. That's more or less what we're going to sell. That way we quiet everybody down, and you go about your own business with your own open-mindedness about your own personal adventure, and then you find out for yourself whether or not this was worth doing. And most people find out that it's one of the best things that they ever did for themselves.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Another thing that is totally drilled into our heads forever is the concept of needing to count calories in order to moderate our weight or remain at a healthy weight. What say you to the folks that are stuck like I was on that concept?
Yes. This is where it's useful to think about psychology in the context of evolution. You can't really understand psychology without the context of evolution.
Right.
And for the 20th century, academic psychology was completely blind to evolution. They literally, evolution didn't enter the discussion in academic psychology until 1992. So essentially they missed the whole century. And there's many reasons for that are historically very fascinating. But actually I'll give your folks a minute as to why.
Okay.
And that is that evolution, the theory of evolution became entwined in the early 20th century with some major thinkers that were related to Darwinian thought. And for example, people like Carl Pearson, who is a brilliant statistician, and he's responsible for the mathematical development and discovery of what's called the correlation coefficient. And so these are major league thinkers. They also happen to be very interested in eugenics. So they were interested in eugenics because they were seeing the low classes in England breeding in Cheapside, and they basically said they're going to outbreed all the brains of humanity, and we're all going to be mediocre in 100 years. So they had this notion that this was the way life worked, and they basically said, we can't do this. We've got to chop these people down and have the smart people breed, and I don't know what they were thinking, but that is what they were thinking. And so those ideas actually influenced American immigration policy in the early 20th century. And so the notion was that the genes, they didn't have that word yet in the language particularly, although a few people knew the word. But they basically, no, people weren't talking about that, but they really were thinking that Southern Europeans were inferior to Northern Europeans. And so if you came from a Southern European country, we didn't want you. Okay, this is how policy was being made in Washington, D.C. Now, Adolf Hitler picks up on this. And so Hitler became a eugenicist. And he was very fascinated with this. And now you can hear the reverberations of Hitler and the master race and cleanliness and getting rid of the riffraff, you see. And so it's the same idea. And it came from those people who were not crazies. They were just early biologists that were stumbling around and trying to figure things out for themselves, and they didn't know what they were doing. And so as a result of, obviously, the atrocities of World War II, the notion of biology coming into psychology and starting to talk about psychological processes and what people were made of and what they became essentially darn near illegal to even talk about. So the whole notion of biology coming into psychology became something that if you were a young professor and you were actually even curious and interested in those ideas, there's no way you get tenure. and there's no way you get any funding decisions for research, and you're basically out on your ear. So everybody learns pretty quickly that you have to say, biology has nothing to do with psychology. Biology has nothing to do with psychology. That literally becomes the status quo. It remains the status quo to this day. However, it's been under assault since 1992 with the publication of a seminal work called The Adapted Mind that brought evolution back into psychology. And since that time, evolutionary psychologists have essentially dominated the conceptual and empirical development of the field, even though they're being fought tooth and nail by the old guard, because there's a historical upsettedness about talking about evolutionary principles in psychology. So that fight remains in academia, but now we have divorced the concept. Anybody that thinks about psychology through the lens of evolution is not thinking like an early 20th century eugenicist.
Right.
We're no longer thinking those ways. But we are thinking of human beings as animals. And we are thinking of brains as characteristic of an animal species. And so each kind of creature has its own kind of brain, and it has a set of neural circuits that were designed in order for it to solve the particular adaptive problems that it faced in evolution. And I've completely forgot what your question was. I wandered off. What were you asking?
That was really interesting.
Yeah.
But I was going toward the law of satiation from
Yes.
the pleasure trap.
I knew it had something to do with this. Okay, so it's going to turn out that all creatures throughout the globe, you see, eat to satiation,
Right.
and they don't get fat. So they have a essentially natural law, or the law of evolution would say, that an organism, even in an environment of plenty, would not overeat. It wouldn't do so. If you overeat and you get overly fat, then all kinds of bad biological things are happening. Number one, you're more likely to get injuries. Number two, you're more likely to get run down by a predator. And number three, you are wasting time eating unnecessarily calories and securing them when you could be mating and producing more genes, more DNA, offspring. So there's no way this would happen, and it doesn't happen. So the concept that human beings are independent of all natural history of all other species is utterly ludicrous. So we can essentially put away the notion that human beings would ever have to weigh and measure their food or anything akin to this. Now, there are caveats that I would put out there. Number one, remember what the law of satiation would say, and that is that an animal in its natural habitat would never either overeat or undereat. If it would undereat, it would starve to death. As long as there's food around, it wouldn't starve to death. And it wouldn't overeat either for all the reasons I just talked about, and neither would humans. So notice that it's only humans recently that are overeating. Okay, human beings were not overeating 200 or 300 or 400, 500 years ago. They were in isolated spots, but essentially even around the world today, in places where people are getting enough calories, if those calories are calories that are mimicking the caloric content or the food content of our natural history, people aren't overeating. So people are starting to overeat in China, but 20 years ago they weren't. And they were actually eating as many calories as we eat in the United States, but they're eating low-fat calories, they're eating rice, they're getting decent physical exercise. And it turns out, guess what? You got a couple of billion Asians, and none of them are overweight. Okay, so now what happens? Now McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken come into the fore, and Coca-Cola comes into the fore, and French fries come into the fore, and ice cream comes into the fore, and now what do we got? We have a pandemic of people being overweight. So it's not that people eat too much and need to worry about that, it's what they're eating is the problem. So obviously it's the main issue in satiation for people is going to be what we're going to call stretch reception, which is going to be essentially that the system works as the stomach essentially works as like a balloon, and it's not always open like this, it's a potential space. So as you put food into it, this is happening. And as you put more and more food in, you can feel the stretching of the circuits, and there's neural circuits embedded in the walls of the stomach that are going to tell you, hey chief, that's about enough. Well, on natural food, when you get to I'm about enough, you've had a reasonable amount of calories for the species. So maybe it's that much food, but maybe a pound of food. Well, if you eat a pound of potatoes, you just ate 375 calories. And there's people that are going to say, well, I can eat more than a pound. Yeah, you probably eat a couple of pounds of food if you're a big guy at a setting. So if you eat 2 pounds of food and it's a couple of natural starches like potatoes, potatoes are about 375 calories a pound. So if you were to eat 2 pounds of potatoes, you eat 750 calories, which would be a big meal. Then your stomach would be filled up and you'd have about all you could handle. But if you ate 2 pounds of See's candy, you would have ate 6,000 calories. So you would have eaten, 8 or 9 times the amount of food. And so if you were to eat some French fries, those French fries are very high calorie density. If you eat an ounce of potato chips, that's 150 or 200 calories. So the calorie density of food can range all the way from essentially 0 calories in fiber and water, all the way, it moves across a band, where a salad is 100 calories a pound. You can't survive on it. You need 2,500 calories a day. You can't eat 25 pounds of salad and you would starve to death eventually eating salad. The next thing over is vegetables that you would cook, like asparagus, carrots, things like that. That's about 200 calories a pound. You could survive on those, but it's hard. That's an awful lot of eating. You would personally have to cram in 12 pounds of food a day. That is not natural for our species to eat that much food. So when we start to find out about the calorie density of what people should be eating, all we have to do is say, about how many pounds of food does it take to reach satiation in a human? And that amount of food is about 5 pounds a day for somebody your size. And that's about 2,500 calories, so the food should be about 500 calories a pound. Okay, so on average, that's what our food should look like.
Well, starches.
Starches are right around there. And so we also ate meat in our natural history. That was balanced out by the fact that we would eat some fruit and vegetables that were down at 200 or 300. So in the natural history, we don't need to eat meat, but the point is that we're all aiming somewhere near 500 on average for this 5 pounds of food. But you can imagine what happens to people when they eat a chocolate shake at McDonald's. That thing is unbelievably high calorie density. That's 3,000 calorie a pound type food. And so as a result, you are instantly over that 500 calorie a pound average. And as a result, what's going to happen is you're going to eat the same 5 pounds of food a day. But in that 5 pounds of food, you could easily be eating 4,000 calories. And that's why we have the epidemic of obesity and sickness that we have today, is that people are eating the same amount of food, and yet they're eating vastly more calories than is consistent with the natural history of our species. Weight loss experts that try to get people to portion control and eat less of those rich foods.
Eating in moderation?
Eating essentially in moderation. Trying to eat, if the diet that you're eating is 700 or say 800 calories a pound, and you need 4 pounds of food. Let's say you're a medium-sized female, and you want 4 pounds of food a day, which is about what you would want. If that food is 800 calories a pound because you got a bunch of cheese and mayonnaise on your cheese sandwich, and et cetera, and oil all over your salad, if you have that, then what happens is you're going to eat 3,200 calories, but you only needed 1,900. And you're going to store that extra fat, and you're going to be lugging around. The average American woman gains 2 pounds, interestingly enough, very subtly, a year between her 16th and her 36th birthday. So the average woman in the United States by her 36th birthday is 40 pounds overweight. Now that's incredible. I mean, the price that people are paying psychologically for that, the constant dissonance and shame and embarrassment, the amazing impact, disastrous impact it has on romantic relationships. This is a fiasco of unbelievable proportions. If Martian scientists had a telescope aimed at Earth and they were seeing what had happened in the last century, they would be saying, what on earth is going on? This is a absolute fiasco. And that's what it is. That's called the pleasure trap.
So we've talked about it before, and we just hit all of these, well, not all of them, but a lot of major points out of the pleasure trap. Please get a copy. Dr. Lisle covers everything and much more. He will simplify all these concepts in a very easily digestible format. So I encourage you to get a copy of The Pleasure Trap. Thank you so much, Dr. Lisle, for your time.
Great
So
pleasure.
generous.
Thank you.
A lot of fun.
You bet.
And we'll see you on the next video, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.